up in the immediate future, as in now. Oh, I was going to read from the biography at the back of the book, give you some idea about this evening's speaker. J.F. Derry is a writer who was previously a conservation ecologist and rangeland scientist, mainly working in British and African universities, but also in Spain, Brussels, Mongolia and Australia. He had intended to discover the secrets of life with degrees in biochemistry, bioelectronics and biological computation, but somehow also ended up with a PhD in African ecology, specialising in the consequences of savanna waterholes on plants and animals. Thus, his publication history is mainly in academic journals on aspects of computational biology, pastoralism and grazing studies. Ergo, a recent manuscript on evolution in African bovids, that's antelopes and cattle. He has written for several national newspapers, countless technical reports for various governments, and as a reviewer for several major record labels, the TLS and the University Presses of Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard, several major and independent book publishers, and the National Portrait Gallery. He has also written extensively on Charles Darwin, and his recent poetry can be found in such places as the Human Genre Project. He once collected lion semen, intentionally. How do you ask? Well, the answer is, of course, very carefully. JF lives in Edinburgh with his partner and their 2 daughters. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause to this evening's speaker, Mr. J.F. Derry.
Thank you, Ash. This talk is about Darwin in Scotland, my new book, and I'll be reading copiously from it, but we've got quite a lot to fit in this hour, and we really want to get onto the latter bits. The juicy bit's all about intelligent design. So but firstly, I'll get the pitch out of the way, which is simply that this is actually running out of stock, which makes me very happy, but also very sad, because it means that it's more difficult for you to get a copy. I have some with me this evening, and it's at a knockdown special price just for this audience, so come and see me afterwards. You've had the introduction of me, which kind of qualifies me for why I would like to go and write a book on Darwin, because I have an evolutionary biology background. But what justifies writing a book about Darwin in Scotland? Well, I'm going to read from the preface just to set the scene. Basically, not enough of it was made of previously. So, Darwinian issues always seem topical, but never more so than now. At the time of writing, there is a great excitement at the bicentenary of Charles Darwin's birth, the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species, both in 2009. The centres of this celebration seem to be Downhouse naturally, the Natural History Museum in London, where many of the specimens reside, and Cambridge, his second university and long-term publishers of his work and his correspondence. Without wanting to detract from the events and activities of those 3 English institutions, there are a few additions that ought to be made in order to reaffirm Scotland's role in Darwin's history. In terms of Darwin's legacy, thank you. I couldn't even hear myself. In terms of Darwin's legacy, Scotland was his foremost influence. I'm not maverick in that claim. Janet Brown, the science historian and Darwin biographer, wrote, "Biographers regularly go back to Darwin's Edinburgh years, convinced that the seeds of all his later thinking lie there, and to a larger degree, they are right." Firstly, the celebrations are late. 1856 was a momentous year towards the publication of Darwin's ideas. In that year, he shared his ideas with colleagues, among them his closest friend and ally and a Scot, Joseph Hooker. The response was largely positive, giving Darwin an important confidence boost. Having found acceptance of the ideas, Darwin received the nudge he needed to publish them a short time later, when Charles Lyell, another Scot, you'll see a pattern here, alerted him to similar findings in the work of Alfred Russel Wallace, himself born in Welsh Monmouthshire, but to an English mother and father claiming a direct descent from William Wallace. Thus, they were Scottish sources that inspired the publication of The Origin. As we'll discover later, it was a Scottish source from which that famous book's very title likely came. Secondly, and more important for Darwin's skills as a naturalist, it was time spent in Edinburgh, including along the nearby coastline, and in the Highlands of Scotland, that informed and trained the young man in preparation for his legendary voyage aboard the Beagle, and his subsequent career in science. Darwin would not have developed his theories if he had not attended the University of Edinburgh. His formal tuition here didn't amount to much, but through interaction with his tutors, peers, and extracurricular groups, Darwin was exposed to an ethos of naturalistic philosophy, rooted in the Scottish Enlightenment and by direct descent, the ancient Greeks. If he had bypassed Scotland, going instead straight up to Cambridge, his education would have been theologically based and unlikely to have given him the perspective that led him to question the prevailing doctrine. Of course, in recounting Darwin's well-known history, the emphasis herein may at times seem unusual, mainly because I wanted to focus primarily on the part Scotland has played, and continues to play, in evolutionary science. The real opportunity for 2009 is for Scotland, and particularly Edinburgh, to rightfully claim its part in taking in the young man and providing the people and places that informed the great naturalist. Hence, this book partly makes a contribution towards that goal by investigating the influence of Darwin on contemporary biology, particularly as it is pursued at the University of Edinburgh. However, there's a snag. During the heyday of Victorian science, it was still possible to be a scientific generalist, something that Darwin was rather good at. Another example was his contemporary Robert Chambers. Now Chambers, as an English publisher, notably of the songs of Edinburgh publisher, notably of the songs of Robert Burns, a poet himself, a prolific journalist and a public figure, took up a keen interest in geology, and, as was his wont, and befitting for a gentleman of his day, pursued fascinating interests. Chambers' fascination was an all-encompassing, overarching, general evolutionary or development theory. No mean undertaking for a hobby. Well, times have certainly changed. As our understanding developed, we pigeonholed our knowledge within categories and subcategories. Today we continue that tendency to reflect our progress in the discovery of detail with a fractionation of science. For example, there are not many university departments fusing to form institutes of general studies. Today, being a generalist is not so easy, and yet Darwin's work is as far-reaching as it ever was, and it continues to pervade every contemporary biological discipline. The other role for Darwinian evolution puts it at the heart of the science-religion debate, as a counterpoint to contemporary creationism and intelligent design. So that's a bit of a scene setting for you. Firstly, we're going to show of hands for who knew that Darwin ever came to Scotland. So there's some people who didn't know, so if you immediately learned something, that's excellent. You keep your hands up if you knew that he came to the university to study as a medical graduate. So we lost a couple of people. And keep your hands up still if you knew that he was actually Scottish. I've lost you all. I might have been making that last one up. Okay. So, which clan did he belong to?
The McDarwins.
The McDarwins. Let's find out a bit about Darwin's actual time here. But you know, it's really confusing and bewildering why this phase in his life history has been overlooked so much, especially if it's had such an influence. And it's really easy to trace that it has had a huge influence on him. You know? I really do hold that he would not have produced his works and his ideas if he hadn't come here. And we'll find out a little bit why, what the scene was at the time. But as an example of how it's overlooked, for example, last year was my centenary year. There were some TV radio programs. There's a really good one by Melvin Bragg that did a series of radio programs. It started off in Shrewsbury, first episode. Second episode, Cambridge. I mean, where was the bit in between? You know, and it's also being, you know, even by reputable science-based publishers, it's still being sent out to children as completely overlooked. And it's kind of interesting and informative to understand where these things came from. Well, in a children's book released last year by Templar, it says, after his mother died in 1817, young Charles was sent to a nearby school while his elder sisters took over the running of the household. His father wanted Charles to follow in his footsteps, and so he was sent to medical school in Edinburgh. Well, that's all okay. He did not enjoy the experience, nor did he greatly impress his tutors. So it's decided that he should become a clergyman instead. And off to Cambridge he goes. So, you know, like one sentence is the most you ever get. Well, there is a little bit more to say, about 192 pages worth, so we'll bang on, as they say. The first chapter is called Scientific Naturalism. A nice coincidence, last year was also 250 years of Robert Burns, so I think these are called epigraphs underneath the title of each chapter, and each one is a Burns quote. This one is Edina Scotia's Darling Seat, off the top of my head. So often Edinburgh is thought to be the pride of Scotland, but not everyone would agree. Aberdeen, Dundee, Inverness, Perth, Stirling, or particularly Glasgow are hard done by according to that vote. each having had equal cause for share of Scottish prestige. For example, Edinburgh wasn't even the first Scottish university. It followed establishment of academic institutions in St Andrews, Glasgow, Aberdeen, becoming Scotland's fourth university in 1583, at a time when England had only two, Oxford and Cambridge. However, and core to this book, Edinburgh's academic pedigree took the fall for its cosmopolitan perspective and central role in the Scottish Enlightenment during the latter half of the 18th century. The Scottish Enlightenment arose out of the combination of social factors: the national programme of public education, cemented by the 1696 Education Act, achieved world-leading levels of adult literacy and new international links throughout the British Empire, following the unpopular 1707 Act of Union, which proffered opportunities for commercial prosperity. In addition, an enduring special relationship with France, itself undergoing a revolution of thought, brought a celebration of intellectual critique and rationalism, and paved the way for many of the advances in philosophical thinking to follow. The tangible products of this period included several that would be vital components of Darwin's education in Scotland: debating societies, journals, and the explosive rise of the book industry. The Scottish Enlightenment movement was riveted in moral philosophy, history, and economics. While it can be traced to the University of Glasgow, people like Francis Hutcheson, Adam Smith, Thomas Reid, John Miller, and there were the likes of James Dunbar attending the Aberdeen Philosophical Society, many of the key figures were at the University of Edinburgh. People like William Robertson, Adam Ferguson, Dougal Stewart, or outside academia, but living in the city: Henry Home, Robert Wallace, James Stewart, and James Anderson. But outstanding in this latter group was David Hume, exponent of modern scientific empiricism, founded on experience and observation, upon which all scientific truth has rested ever since. Indeed, without Hume, every gem of science would glisten with a significantly lesser light. So, the next time you're passing by a statue on the High Street, or also known as the Royal Mile, or the graveside at Carlton Hill Cemetery, a moment of reflective tribute may be due. Also up on that smallest of the seven hills of Edinburgh, you cannot fail to see a Parthenon replica, the National Monument. This building is otherwise known as Edinburgh's disgrace, and otherwise Edinburgh's folly, for its unfinished state through exhaustion of funds. It's only one of the reasons why the city earned its name Athens of the North. The Athenian parallel with the classical period extends to the influence that Scotland had on the modern world, just as Greece had once enlightened the ancient world. Now, if those lines of association run parallel, then others arrange in series as lineages of inheritance from those ancient philosophies. Hume, for one, was directly influenced by Pyrrho, founder of Pyrrhonian skepticism, in contrast to Plato's academic skepticism. He was also indirectly influenced by the accumulation of independent rational thought that had occurred across the 2 millennia since the beginning of philosophy itself, a line going back to Thales of Miletus. Now, Thales was the first to attempt explanation of natural phenomena in rational terms. His approach replaced supernatural interpretations with a scientific method and experimental protocol. This rationalism defines a clear line from ancient Greece via the Scottish Enlightenment straight to the Victorian scientific naturalism, or methodological naturalism, to which Charles Darwin was first exposed at the University of Edinburgh. I then go on to describe a little bit about the modern college and the way that it extends all the way out to China in its modern footprint on the globe. And then go into a bit about the more humble beginnings it had. Now, if you pop over to Old College on the bridges now, they're excavating out the central, well, what used to be a car park, but it's, yeah, the central area, and it's revealing part of the old Tunis College, which dates back to 1558, I'm rightly informed. And it's really worth a look, because it's nice that they're kind of trying to conserve and preserve that. Having established a bit of history about the college, which and its architecture and the way it's developed, I then asked the question, but why would Darwin choose to attend Edinburgh? The quick answer is that he didn't. His father decided for him, and Edinburgh was chosen because it was a family tradition to go there to study medicine. In fact, anyone pursuing a career in medicine was wise to go to Edinburgh, as since the mid-18th century it had been the best medical school. But Oxford and Cambridge could give you academic teaching, but only if you're an Anglican, and they had no hospitals. London had no shortage of hospitals, but they had no university at that stage. Edinburgh had both a hospital and a university, allowing the parallel teaching of both theory and practice not afforded by anywhere else at that time. And this is the simple reason why both Darwin's grandfather and father received their medical training at the University of Edinburgh. Grandfather Erasmus in 1755, aged 22, and Father Robert in 1786, aged 20, both forging family ties and friendships while they did. One Darwin never managed to leave. Darwin's uncle, another Charles Darwin, died from meningococcal meningitis, contracted during a post-mortem while studying in Edinburgh. He was buried in the Duncan family vault in the Chapel of Ease at St Cuthbert's Church, which is just beyond the west end of Princes Street Gardens on the corner of Lothian Road and King Stable Road. Hence, there was an ever-increasing inevitability that Darwin would end up in Edinburgh, given its prominence as a seat of medical learning and the Darwin family connections, together with his father's growing exasperation with his lackadaisical son. In 1825, his father chastised him thus:
"You care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat-catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and your family."
Robert Darwin was a big guy, so Darwin's father also took action to rein in his wayward son by removing him from his school in Shrewsbury, 2 years prematurely, for having achieved only ordinary grades. Darwin's exit was recorded in his journal with undertones of understandable apprehension and self-pity.
1825, June 17th. Left Shrewsbury School forever. 16 years old.
Darwin's mother, Susanna, née Wedgwood, had died when he was 8 years old, so he had nowhere to turn for motherly sympathy. To make matters worse, his male relatives had set vertiginously high standards. For example, his grandfather and father had been elected to the Royal Society while still audaciously young, aged 30 and 22 respectively. This goal Darwin would eventually meet, also when aged 30. But at that time, everything must have seemed pointless and unachievable. Amazingly, his family tradition would be kept going by 3 out of 6 of his own sons. Francis, when 34, George, also 34, and Horace, when 52. Reined in and coming to appreciate the lifelong financial security promised by his father's wealth, a benefit of having married into the Wedgwood pottery dynasty, Darwin obediently spent the summer of 1825 showing his own promise as a physician, tending to around a dozen of his father's patients. But at summer's end, and in a repeat of history, he was forcibly sent to medical school to study medicine in Edinburgh, just as his father had been forced by his grandfather. By treading in the footsteps of grandfather and father, the intention was for Bobby to shadow his brother that's Erasmus Alvey, 5 years his senior, and embarking on his year of hospital study from his own medical course at Christ's College, Cambridge. As soon as he was old enough, Darwin would also be expected to sit medical examinations. When he did leave home, he had to pay £7 for his own travel northwards to that new and alien environment.
October. Went with Erasmus to Edinburgh.
But perhaps the prospect was not that daunting. Darwin was used to living away from home as a boarder in Shrewsbury. Additionally, he was accompanying his beloved brother with whom he shared interests in chemistry and the outdoors. Young, yes, but from his schooling and adolescent letters, one can see that he was also self-aware and rebellious. Useful buffers in a foreign land, a land that was on an increasingly good terms with his English kind, ceremoniously marked by a visit of King George IV in 1822, which incidentally raised the kilt, banned by the Dress Act in 1746, and reinstated in 1782 to an emblem of national identity. So a bit of scene setting about the times. One can go into further descriptions of the city at the time and the culture and what was happening on a day-to-day basis that he would have encountered. A little bit more of that is drawn out in chapter 2. I'm doing the time.
25 minutes.
We're going to make it? Yeah. Okay, so we carry on. Darwin's Scottish Enlightenment, and the Burns quote here is, "Among the rocks and streams." I expected more from you, honestly.
I didn't.
The oldest influence on Darwin in Scotland came from the very rocks he studied there. In geological terms, modern humans came much, much later. Since appearing, we have been philosophizing every time.
You've never said that right once.
I'll have to rewrite this book. Since appearing, he's been philosophizing about natural processes for only a comparatively short time. Nonetheless, and from the very outset, there have been an impressive range of disparate ideas. For example, Thales' protege, Anaximander of Miletus, was the first to suggest that life had started from slime, and man had evolved, albeit directly, from fish. Now, Aristotle's theory of evolution somehow didn't even involve any significant changes, living forms being maintained from one generation to the next in perpetuity, and yet somehow incorporated the spontaneous generation of shellfish. Empedocles of Agrigentum first recognised progression in living forms, and also wrote about the struggle of existence and the survival of the fittest, as also did Titus Lucretius Carus. Now, while some of these ideas would have been alluded to in the university coursework, it's unlikely that Darwin would have been called a student of these ancient philosophers at this stage. Aristotle's ideas would feature throughout much of Darwin's later influential reading, including Malthus, Lyell, and Herschel. Living in London and beginning to have his own early ideas on transportation, he even made a note to diligently
read Aristotle to see whether any of my own views are ancient.
But while still at Edinburgh, more immediate to Darwin were his newly appointed teachers and newly met peers, in addition to the influence of his own family. Erasmus Darwin, his grandfather, was known to him as an evolutionist. However, it is Darwin whom we call the true father of evolution. So, what is it about his work that's more important to us than any other, ever since those ancient Greeks? Natural selection, you say? But even natural selection had been proposed previously for purposes of explaining adaptation by those early philosophers, Empedocles and Lucretius, then much later by Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis, Denis Diderot, James Hutton, Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. Natural selection had even been implicated in speciation by William Charles Wells and Patrick Matthew, and famously by Alfred Russel Wallace. So why is Charles Darwin a household name? The reason is because of the way in which he did it, his method. Darwin's use of his own acute powers of observation in tandem with the stringent scientific empiricism passed down by Hume and by then considered mandatory by methodological naturalists meant that his discoveries were so robust that he was able to both comment broadly about science at large and also comment in great detail within disciplines. Not only that, but his work was so mechanistically well rooted in the fundament of self-replicating life that it has relevance to every biological discipline, including those which hadn't even been established in his day. While the popularity of his ideas was no doubt initially assisted by the era of discovery of the Victorian era, paved by the Age of Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment, when probably for the first time some factions were prepared to accept alternative explanations for the historical accounts inherited from their forefathers, the persistent longevity of his ideas is beyond doubt. No one can claim that they haven't survived the test of time. Darwin's view of the world and an ability to measure it were instigated in Scotland. The University of Edinburgh seems to have been a bountiful source of influences on the young 16-year-old, and he lapped up its strangeness and charm.
Edinburgh, Sunday morning. My dear father, as I suppose Erasmus has given all the particulars of our journey, I will say no more about it, except that altogether it had cost me £7. We got into our lodgings yesterday evening, which are very comfortable and near the college. Our landlady, by name Mrs. Mackay, is a nice clean old body and exceedingly civil and attentive. She lives in 11 Lothian Street, Edinburgh, and only 4 flights of steps from the ground floor, which is very moderate to some of the other lodgings we were nearly taking. The terms are £1 6 for 2 very nice and light bedrooms and a nice sitting room. By the way, light bedrooms are very scarce articles in Edinburgh, since most of them are little holes in which there is neither air or light. We called on Dr. Hawley the first morning, whom I think we never should have found had it not been for a good-natured Doctor of Divinity, who took us into the library and showed us a map, and gave us how to find him. Indeed, all the Scotchmen are so civil and attentive that it is enough to make an Englishman ashamed of himself. I should think Dr. Butler, or any other fat English divine, would take 2 utter strangers into his library and show them the way. When at last we found the doctor, and having made all the proper speeches on both sides, we all 3 set out and walked all about the town, which we admire excessively. Indeed, Bridge Street is the most extraordinary thing I ever saw. When we first looked over the sides, we could hardly believe our eyes when, instead of a fine river, we saw a stream of people. We spend all our mornings in promenading about the town, which we know pretty well, and in the evenings we go to the play to hear Miss Stevens, which is quite delightful. She is very popular here, being encored to such a degree that she can hardly get on with the play. On Monday we are going to don't know how to spell the rest of the word. Before we got into our lodgings, we were staying at the Star Hotel in Princess Street, where to my surprise I met with an old schoolfellow whom I very much like. He's just come back from a walking tour in Switzerland and is now going to study for his degree. The introductory lectures begin next Wednesday, and we were matriculated for them on Saturday. We pay 10 shillings and write our names in a book, and the ceremony is finished. But the library is not free for us until we get a ticket from a professor. We've just been to church and heard a sermon of only 20 minutes. I expected from Walter Scott's account a soul-cutting discourse of 2 hours and a half. I remain, your affectionate son, C. Darwin.
This stuff writes itself. Consequently, concerns about his immaturity would have been quickly put to rest. His newfound freedom cultivated pomposity, common among new undergraduates. His brashness was communicated to his sister Caroline as indignation, if slighted.
I am very much surprised that Papa should so forget himself as to call me a collegian of the University of Edinburgh, a boy!
There are plenty of young men who can claim that title. In the academic year 1825-26, there were in the university 2,013 students in medicine, arts and law, of whom 902 were in medicine, and 250 of these came from England. However, only about 20% would be expected to graduate through the Edinburgh model, described as a two-tiered model of medical education. Any student, whatever his previous background or studies, could attend classes, but only the privileged few whose families could support them through 3 years of study and whose Latin could sustain them through a thesis and examination could graduate. Solvent undergraduates from affluent backgrounds usually had funds for recreation. In Edinburgh, this has historically involved the opportunity to experiment with recreational drugs, something in which the Darwins partook.
The gaieties of Edinburgh are now just beginning. Do you remember Lady Harriet talking about inhaling nitric oxide? Johnson has actually done it, and describes the effects as the most intense pleasure he ever felt. We both mean to get tipsy in the vacation.
All told, Darwin's first year was mostly notable for sharing the fourth-floor digs at Mrs. Mackay's of 11 Logan Street with Erasmus, and being invited to socialise with family friends. At school, he had been an avid reader, loving poetry, particularly that of Byron and the historical plays of Shakespeare. At Edinburgh, Darwin continued that passion, he and Erasmus checking out more books from the library than all the other students combined, although some, he admitted, were not strictly of course material.
I've been most shockingly idle, actually reading 2 novels at once.
But after only 4 months, Erasmus left, and Darwin was abandoned to suffer the intolerably dull lectures that he could still recall vividly 55 years later for his autobiography.
With the exception of those on chemistry by Hope, whereas Dr. Duncan's lectures on materia medica at 8 o'clock on a winter's morning are something fearful to remember. Dr. Munro made his lectures on human anatomy as dull as he was himself, and the subject disgusted me.
A better idea of his daily timetable comes from the first part of Caroline's letter.
Edinburgh, January 6th, 1826. My dear Caroline, many thanks for your very entertaining letter, which was a great relief after hearing a long, stupid lecture from Duncan on materia medica. But as you know nothing either of the lecturer or lecturers, I will give you a short account of them. Dr. Duncan is so very learned that his wisdom has left no room for his senses, and he lectures, as I have already said, on the materia medica, which cannot be translated into any word expressive enough of its stupidity. These last few mornings, however, he has shown signs of improvement, and I hope he will go on as well as can be expected. His lectures begin at 8 in the morning. Dr. Hope begins at 10 o'clock, and I like both him and his lectures very much, after which Erasmus goes to Mr. Lizard's on anatomy, who is a charming lecturer. At 12, the hospital, after which I attended Munro on anatomy. I dislike him and his lectures so much that I cannot speak with decency about them. He is so dirty in person and actions. Thrice a week we have what is called clinical lectures, which means lectures on the sick people in the hospitals. Those I like very much. I said this account should be short, but I am afraid it has been too long, like the lectures themselves. I remain your affectionate dear Caroline, C. Darwin. Look to Papa and tell him I'm going to write to him in a few days.
I'm going to jump a bit now. I'm going to read this a bit out. Could you get the slideshow?
Yes, I can possibly do that, yes.
At this point, I then describe the difficulties in obtaining cadavers for your medical work. Now, everyone knows about bone and hair, and it happened just a little while after Darwin was actually here in Edinburgh. And the people that were featuring in his life on a daily basis, like Knox, were absolutely, very much embroiled and caught up in that whole scandal. It ended, of course, with Hare turned King's evidence and fled the country, whilst Burke, he was watched by 25,000 spectators. Burke was hanged in Edinburgh's Lawn Market and then fittingly dissected by Munro, the person who was behind the cadavers in the first place, in the University of Edinburgh's medical school. And his skeleton still hangs there for students to observe. The skin was made into various items, including a pocketbook, and that pocketbook is currently on display in the Surgeons' Hall Museum. So only a matter of months before this particular couple of resurrectionists, as they were called, were at large, dealing in the dead, Darwin was having to attend anaesthetised operations on the living. Two in particular he found most disgusting, and more disgusting than Monroe in his Human Anatomy. It was an experience he never repeated or needed to.
The two cases fairly haunted me for many a long year.
These operations and general boredom probably figured in Darwin's intention to go home early before the new semester. His journey was to include return via Glasgow.
I mean to go as far as Glasgow by the canals, and from thence on terra firma to Shrewsbury, but sending my books by sea.
This is a real show of independence, likely inspired by Erasmus's account of his trip there by canal in early March, involving bottled beer and toddy. This suggestion was not well received. His father sent protestations. Firstly, indirectly, via Darwin's sister, Susan.
My dear Charlie, I was very well pleased to receive your last letter, as I hope you are getting in better humour with Edinburgh now that spring has come. Do go some day to see Rosslyn Castle, which I believe is within a few miles from Edinburgh, and it is very well worth seeing. At present, they have made a diorama of it in London. My reason for writing so soon is that I have a message from Papa to give you, which I'm afraid you won't like. He desires me to say that he thinks your plan of picking and choosing what lectures you like to attend not at all a good one, and as you cannot have enough information to know what may be of use to you, it is quite necessary for you to bear with a good deal of stupid and dry work. But if you do not discontinue your present indulgent way, your course of study will be utterly useless. Papa was sorry to hear that you thought of coming home before the course of lectures were finished, but hopes you will not do so. I am so sleepy, I must wish you good night. Your ever affectionate, Susan.
Now, when Darwin proved unrelenting of his plans, Susan's tip-off was followed up a few weeks later by a joint letter from his other sisters, Emily and Caroline, conveying relief at his acceptance of their father's will, which had delayed his departure, and had probably wanted to thwart it entirely.
Thank you, dear Charles, for your very kind, affectionate letter. You cannot tell how much I value your love. I am very glad we shall have you at home again soon, and Papa is very glad that you have remained to attend all the lectures, as he is sure they will be useful to you. He wants to know if you are thinking of any excursion in your way home to see any new country that you did not pass through as you went to Edinburgh. Papa is rather surprised that you're going to Glasgow, as there's nothing worth seeing in your way there. And he should have thought it a better plan to leave as much of your heavy luggage as you can in Edinburgh, as you will return there, and so not of the plague of the carriage of it backwards and forwards.
To clear his head of anatomy and likely put some distance between himself and the long reach of home, Darwin took an energetic walking holiday in North Wales with two friends during the summer of 1826 and became further inspired to observe wildlife and record his observations from reading the Reverend Gilbert White's The Natural History of Selborne. After the summer, he returned to a more social second year in Edinburgh. He became acquainted with the surgeon and future geologist William Francis Ainsworth, William McGilvery, the conservator of the Royal College of Surgery Museum, where he attended talks, Mr. Leonard Horner, Charles Darwin's future father-in-law, who
Also took me once to a meeting of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, where I saw Sir Walter Scott in the chair as president.
and, importantly, a freed black slave, John Edmondson, who fueled his wanderlust while teaching him taxidermy.
I am going to learn to stuff birds from a blackamoor, I believe, an old servant of Dr. Duncan. It was the recommendation of cheapness, if it has nothing else, as he only charges 1 guinea for an hour every day for 2 months.
This was a sound investment, as it would prove invaluable on the Beagle voyage. Their racial differences would not have been an issue, as Darwin had been raised strongly anti-slavery. A psychological analysis of his letter writing at the time has suggested that exposure to Edmondson's life story may also have given him some perspective on his own position. On April the 8th, 1826, in a letter to his sister Caroline, thanking her for her kind letter, Charles wrote 2 sentences that reveal a maturing, introspective perspective and a self-deprecating stance that reappeared throughout his life.
It makes me feel how very ungrateful I have been to you for all the kindness and trouble you took for me when I was a child. Indeed, I often cannot help wondering at my own blind ungratefulness.
Also notably, he joined the student body Plinian Society, established by geologist Professor Robert Jamison and dominated by radical naturalists. Prompted by future physician John Coldstream, Darwin presented a paper there on the marine biology of the Firth of Forth, which he had sampled from dredge boats at Newhaven and in the tidal pools near Preston Pans. These seaside excursions were made with possibly Darwin's single most important influence, the anatomist Dr. Robert Edmund Grant. While 17 years older than Darwin and therefore an unlikely companion, Grant was a graduate of Edinburgh's medical school, but had not continued on to practice as a physician. In preference, he was an avid naturalist, and so perhaps a promise of future prospects for the disillusioned medical student, Darwin. Grant was also friends with the as yet untarnished Robert Knox and the French naturalist Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, forming a direct international link between the University of Edinburgh's School of Anatomy and the hub of Lamarckism in Paris, for which they shared a passion. With Lamarckism came an acceptance of anti-Aristotelian transmutationism, a radical and challenging position for anyone coming from outside progressive Scotland. However, thanks to his free-thinking background, Darwin was already aware that alternative ideas existed in natural history, even if he hadn't readily grasped their evolutionary significance.
I knew him well. He was dry and formal in manner, but with much enthusiasm beneath this outer crust. He one day, when we were talking together, burst forth in high admiration of Lamarck and his views on evolution. I listened in silent astonishment, and as far as I can judge, without any effect on my mind. I had previously read the Zoonomia of my grandfather, in which similar views are maintained, but without producing any effect on me. Nevertheless, it is probable that the hearing rather early in life such views, maintained and praised, may have favoured my upholding of them under a different form in my Origin of Species.
So 2 chapters there to really set the scene about the history and the reasons for him coming here, which were certainly not to open his mind towards natural history, but to train him as a medical student, which clearly wasn't going to suit him at all. And again, he was moved on, as it said from that clip, by his father to Cambridge, taking with him a really different attitude towards life and the world to what he came to Edinburgh with. The images in the background that you're seeing, a lot of them are from the book. There's 2 sections of photography which are taken for the book. Some lovely studies in black and white. There's also a facsimiles section which presents a selection, not entirety, a selection of the extant diaries and natural notes that he made on walks, natural walks or nature walks rather, with Erasmus. We've got a choice here. We can either field some questions at this point, and then do another reading of the intelligent design stuff, or we can cut to the chase and get to that subject matter straight away. What would you like to do?
Intelligent design.
Just very certain.
Okay, let's kick on to intelligent design. I thought you might. That's why we prepared it.
And those of you who came along to the previous talk at the Sunday sermon will please know I will not be affecting an Australian accent this time, after offending the whole of the South Coast.
However, be warned. Critics, hasn't it?
Yeah, I know, exactly. They just don't appreciate the amount of time and effort you put into these things.
Intelligent design, and the Burns quote is, "Oh, thou great unknown power." I can't give it some slack. I thought it was quite good. The human intellect is desperate to investigate the context of its very existence, but there are huge gaps in our understanding. That's okay. Most people would probably think it's honest and honourable to admit to not knowing everything. But what about claiming that you know a certain amount and then invoking a supernatural explanation for the bits you don't? To then use this in argument is like turning your own ignorance into a weapon against your adversaries. The intelligent design movement, the most recent case attempting to suggest wholesale doubt within scientific ranks, unfortunately has the appearance of doing just that. The scientists largely refuse to be drawn to debate, stating that intelligent design is, ironically, just a resurrection of Paley's natural theology, and thus a modern twist to old Earth creationism. This section is in two parts. In this chapter we deal with some biological and theological aspects of intelligent design, and in the next chapter we investigate some political ramifications, specifically the consequences for our educational systems. I don't think we're going to get to the education bit, but that is a thread throughout the book. Darwin's own education, what he gained from inside and more importantly peripheral to the formal education that he came to receive, and then the feedback, the legacy he left behind through his ideas, and the consequences for our modern education, what's happening in contemporary science here in universities and in Scotland, and also what's being fed to our children in primary schools and upwards. And it's pretty horrific. So agnosticism has become a bit of a dirty word for being non-committal in the arenas of strongly held views and bullish opinion. Well, there was nothing irresolute about Huxley, who introduced the term in 1869 to describe his firm rejection of natural theology, while still being able to accept biblical moral teachings. Like his friend and colleague Darwin, Huxley also strove for truth and understanding through Hume's scientific method. He considered Hume's Natural History of Religion, one of the first robust naturalistic analyses of faith as a human behaviour, to have anticipated the results of modern investigation. Thus, it was not a cowardly escape by Huxley to admit that there being gaps in his understanding, without Greek knowledge, Greek gnosis, gnosis, agnostic. It was a confident and courageous salute to the complexity in nature and complexity in our intelligence as a part of nature. From Huxley's later essay, Agnosticism, in 1889,
when I reached intellectual maturity and began to ask myself whether I was an atheist, a theist, or a pantheist, a materialist or an idealist, Christian or freethinker, I found that the more I learned and reflected, the less ready was the answer, until at last I came to the conclusion that I had neither art nor part with any of these denominations, except the last. The one thing in which most of these good people were agreed was the one thing in which I differed from them. They were quite sure that they had attained a certain gnosis, had, more or less successfully, solved the problem of existence, while I was quite sure I had not, and had a pretty strong conviction that the problem was insoluble. And with Hume and Kant on my side, I could not think myself presumptuous in holding fast by that opinion. So I took thought, and invented what I conceived to be the appropriate title of agnostic. It came into my head as suggestively an antithetic to the agnostic of church history, who professed to know so much about the very things of which I was ignorant, and I took the earliest opportunity of parading it at our society. Agnosticism, in fact, is not a creed, but a method, the essence of which lies in the rigorous application of a single principle. That principle is of great antiquity. It is as old as Socrates, as old as the writer who said, "Try all things, hold fast by that which is good." It is the foundation of the Reformation, which simply illustrated the axiom that every man should be able to give a reason for the faith that is in him. It is the great principle of Descartes. It is the fundamental axiom of modern science. Positively, the principle may be expressed in matters of the intellect. Follow your reason as far as it will take you, without regard to any other consideration. And negatively, in matters of the intellect, do not pretend that conclusions are certain which are not demonstrated or demonstrable. That I take to be the agnostic faith.
Hume's empiricism demands that an idea must be demonstrable before becoming a known matter of fact, and Huxley's agnosticism was an admission to gaps in that knowledge. He was making a move away from creationism, whereas intelligent design is seen as a political god of the gaps, and a return to creationism. The tragedy is that intelligent design advocates are honestly trying hard to integrate science and religion, ulterior, more political motives aside. The travesty is that it is presented purely as a science, whereas in fact it doesn't fully match Huxley's agnosticism as an exacting and discerning methodology for truth. However, one of the main advocates, William A. Dembski, defends intelligent design as having a starting point quite different to that of creationism. Creationism is always a doctrine about where did everything come from ultimately. Intelligent design rarely falls under the engineering sciences. What we found is in the last 30 years with advances in molecular biology and biochemistry and the information sciences is that there are features of biological systems that cannot be understood and explained apart from through intelligence or purpose. What we have in the cell, for instance, we've got signal transduction circuitry, complex motors, military machineries. We need nanotechnology and engineering sciences to understand these explicit systems and explain how they came about in the first place. What is the ultimate intelligence behind things? It could be an alien intelligence, it could be a natural intelligence built into our world. Although this argument is well versed in the language of modern science, it does echo the incredulity voiced by Paley in his natural theology, in which he famously includes his watchmaker's analogy.
In crossing a heath, suppose I put my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But I suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of that of an answer that I had been given before. There must have existed at some point, at some place or other, an artificer or artificers who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being great or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you, Your Worship. Of course, Paley named God as his creator of complexity, something from which intelligent design supporters tend to dissociate and leave open to question. Rather, the argument for complexity is made solely on the basis of our current explanations being unsatisfactory. For William A. Dembski, Darwinian natural selection is incapable for the purpose. Dembski again. Before Darwin, the power of choice was confined to designing intelligences, to conscious agents that could reflect deliberately on the possible consequences of their choices. Darwin's claim to fame was to argue that natural forces, lacking in purposelessness or provision of future possibilities, likewise has the power to choose. Accordingly, Darwin invented an oxymoron, natural selection. In ascribing the power to choose to natural selection, Darwin perpetrated the greatest intellectual swindle in the history of ideas. Nature has no power to choose. All natural selection does is narrow the variability of incidental organismal change by weeding out the less fit. Moreover, it acts on the spur of the moment, based solely on what the environment at the present time deems fit, and thus without any provision of future possibilities. And yet this blind process, when coupled with another blind process, namely incidental organismal change, which neo-Darwinians understand as genetic mutations, is supposed to produce designs that exceed the capacities of any designers in our experience. No wonder Daniel Dennett in Darwin's Dangerous Idea credits Darwin with the single best idea anyone has ever had. Getting design without a designer is a good trick indeed. But with advances in technology as well as in the information and life sciences, especially molecular biology, it's a trick that can no longer be maintained. It's time to lay aside the smoke screens and the hand waving, the just so stories and the stonewalling, the bluster and bluffs, and explain scientifically what people have known right along, namely why the appearance of design in biology is not merely an appearance, but in fact the result of an actual intelligence. This is the fundamental claim of intelligent design.
Wanker.
Back to me, by the way. Just in case you're confused, the immediately obvious question at this point, and one asked many times over, is what is the source of that design and intelligence? I mean, Darwinists already have a solution, but what is the alternative? Daniel C. Dennett makes a suggestion.
In the decades since Darwin's Dangerous Idea appeared, I have spent thousands of hours discussing the implications of Darwinism with people in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, and I never cease to be amazed at the complacency with which so many of them just assume that they can dismiss out of hand any Darwinian account of human learning or creativity. What do they think is going on in their brains, and how do they imagine that brains work their magic?
They are sure that something wonderful is going on, no doubt, something much too complicated for them to understand. But they ignore the analysis that cuts through all this complexity and points so unmistakably to Darwin's direction. A learning or innovating brain is, by definition, really, a brain whose current design enables it to revise its own design in appropriate response to novel information. Self-redesigning design processes. Is such a thing possible? Either brains have been designed by non-miraculous means to revise their own designs by non-miraculous means, or minds are miracles. Darwinian natural selection is the only model of such processes that is known to work, and it works on many levels. People who would rightly scoff at anyone who imagined there were flying carpets or perpetual motion machines need to confront their own breezy assurances that minds are neither miraculous nor Darwinian in their origin, development, and operation. Can they describe an alternative?
It's been such an eminent guest, I think we'll end there. There is more to that chapter. Firstly, I described these images in our part of the book. I won't go through them because I think you recognise most of them in the book by the book, so I know what they are anyway. And just to mention, other than Dennett, we have in the book contributions by Michael Behe, another ID guy, some really good scientists from the university here, Nick Barton, for example, Mark Blackster, Brian Charlesworth, very famous geneticist. We've also got input from Noam Chomsky, Richard Dawkins, Dembski you've heard, Dent you've heard, Richard L. Gregory, famous neuropsychologist, would you call him, perhaps? Ken Ham himself, Adrian Hawkes, who you remember from the Root of All Evil programme, at the Creationist School, Richard Holloway, the ex-bishop of Edinburgh, Randall Keynes, great-great-great-grandson of Darwin, Aubrey Manning, a BBC presenter, Sir Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal, and last but not least, Dr. Martin Murray, in the audience, who adds a fantastic observation about Darwin's own observational powers. I will take some questions.
We don't have time.
In the bar. Where I could be selling books and signing them at the same time. Please buy the book, Baby Needs New Shoes.
Okay guys, can we have a round of applause for JF Derry?